The crowd at Soldier Field erupted as Sarah Martinez landed the final devastating blow that would change professional boxing forever. Standing at just 5 feet 6 inches and weighing only 165 pounds, she had just knocked out the most feared heavyweight champion in the world. The same woman they said was too small to even step into the ring with real heavyweights. The same fighter they had banned from competition for failing to meet their arbitrary size requirements. As Viktor Petrov crashed to the canvas and the referee counted him out, Sarah raised her gloves to the sky, knowing that this moment would echo through every boxing gym, every commission office, and every barrier that had ever told someone they weren't big enough to chase their dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning, cutting through the Chicago winter darkness like a razor blade. Sarah Martinez rolled out of her narrow bed in the cramped studio apartment, her body aching from another brutal training session the night before. The radiator clanked and wheezed, struggling to push heat through pipes that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Through her single window, she could see the meatpacking plant where she'd been working the overnight shift for the past 3 years, its smokestacks already belching steam into the pre-dawn sky. Most people would look at Sarah's life and see nothing but struggle. The peeling paint on her apartment walls, the secondhand furniture held together with duct tape, the work boots by her door that reeked of industrial cleaner and animal fat. They'd see a 28-year-old woman grinding through minimum wage work just to keep the lights on, living paycheck to paycheck in one of Chicago's forgotten neighborhoods. What they wouldn't see was the carefully maintained heavy bag hanging in the corner of her living room, or the worn leather boxing gloves that sat on her kitchen table like sacred artifacts. They wouldn't notice the way her hands moved with unconscious precision as she wrapped them each morning, or the fluid grace in her movements as she shadowboxed between the cramped walls. Sarah had been boxing since she was 8 years old, learning the sweet science in her grandfather's garage while other kids played video games. Roberto Martinez had been a legend in Chicago's underground boxing scene during the 1960s, a lightweight who could have gone professional if the doors hadn't been firmly shut to Mexican immigrants who spoke broken English and had no connections to the established boxing world. Instead, he'd channeled his passion into teaching neighborhood kids how to protect themselves, how to turn anger into art, how to find dignity in the disciplined violence of the squared circle. When Sarah was 12, she'd started training at Santa's underground boxing gym, a converted warehouse in the South Side where Coach Maria Santos took in fighters that the fancy gyms wouldn't touch. Maria had been a professional women's boxer in the 90s, fighting when women's boxing was barely recognized as a legitimate sport, earning pocket change for battles that left her with permanent scars and a left eye that never quite focused properly. She saw something special in Sarah from the first day the quiet girl with the serious eyes walked through her doors. Under Maria's guidance, Sarah had become something extraordinary. She'd won every amateur tournament available to women in her weight class, compiling a record of 87 wins and only 3 losses. Her style was unique, combining her grandfather's old-school Mexican boxing fundamentals with Maria's technical precision and a natural power that seemed impossible for someone her size. When Sarah threw her signature left hook, what she called her thunder strike, it carried the force of someone 50 pounds heavier. She'd knocked out fighters who towered over her, broken the ribs of women who outweighed her by 30 pounds, and earned a reputation as the most feared amateur boxer in the Midwest. But there was a problem that had haunted Sarah's entire career, a limitation that no amount of training or talent could overcome. Professional women's boxing had weight classes that topped out at super heavyweight, but the real money, the real recognition, the real respect existed in only one division: men's heavyweight boxing. The heavyweight championship was the pinnacle of the sport, the title that commanded million-dollar purses and worldwide attention. Every other weight class, every other championship, was considered secondary. Sarah had always been too big for women's boxing weight classes but too small for the men's heavyweight division, which traditionally required fighters to weigh over 200 pounds. At 165 pounds, she existed in a boxing purgatory, dominating women who couldn't match her power, while being systematically excluded from the division where her skills could truly shine. She'd spent years watching heavyweight champions who were slower, less technical, and less intelligent fighters than herself, knowing she could beat them, but never getting the chance to prove it. The meatpacking plant work was brutal, but it served a purpose beyond paying rent. Sarah had specifically chosen the overnight shift because it allowed her to train during the day, and the physical demands of hauling carcasses and operating industrial equipment had built a functional strength that complemented her natural boxing ability. Her co-workers, mostly middle-aged men who spoke Spanish and kept their heads down, had no idea that the quiet woman who worked beside them was one of the most accomplished amateur boxers in American history. Maria Santos understood Sarah's frustration better than anyone. She'd faced her own version of the same barriers 30 years earlier, fighting for respect in a sport that treated women as novelty acts rather than serious athletes. The two women would spend hours discussing strategy, not just for upcoming fights, but for how to navigate the political landscape of professional boxing. Maria had connections throughout the boxing world, relationships built over decades of training fighters and working corners in dingy venues where the real future stars cut their teeth. The plan they'd developed was audacious in its simplicity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If Sarah couldn't get recognition fighting in traditional women's divisions, and if the heavyweight division wouldn't accept her because of arbitrary size requirements, they would force the issue. Maria had been researching boxing commission regulations for months, looking for loopholes and precedents that might provide a path forward. What she'd discovered was that the International Heavyweight Boxing Commission, the sport's primary governing body, had never actually written rules explicitly banning fighters based on size. The 200-pound minimum was tradition, not law. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a sports medicine physician who served on the Boxing Commission's medical advisory board, had attended one of Sarah's training sessions. Elena had been studying the relationship between size and boxing safety, investigating whether traditional assumptions about weight and fighting ability were scientifically sound. What she'd observed watching Sarah work had challenged every preconception she'd held about physical requirements for heavyweight boxing. Sarah moved with a precision that was almost mechanical, her footwork creating angles that larger fighters couldn't achieve, her hand speed generating power through perfect technique, rather than raw mass. When Elena had Sarah punch a force measurement device, the results were startling. Despite weighing 60 pounds less than the average heavyweight, Sarah's punches registered impact forces comparable to established champions. Her conditioning was superior, her boxing IQ was off the charts, and her technical skills were more refined than fighters who'd been professional for years. Elena had spent weeks convincing other commission members to observe Sarah's training sessions. The evidence was overwhelming. This woman could compete with and potentially dominate fighters twice her size, not despite her physical dimensions, but because of how perfectly those dimensions suited her fighting style. She was faster than the lumbering giants who dominated heavyweight boxing, more technically sound than the brawlers who relied on size and strength, and possessed knockout power that physics said should be impossible. The formal petition to the International Heavyweight Boxing Commission had been filed on a cold February morning. Maria, Elena, and Sarah had spent months preparing every piece of documentation, every medical evaluation, every performance metric that might support their case. They'd included video analysis of Sarah's fights, biomechanical studies of her punching power, cardiovascular assessments that proved her conditioning exceeded that of established heavyweights, and testimonials from respected trainers who'd witnessed her abilities firsthand. Commissioner Frank Castellano had received their petition with the enthusiasm of a man being handed a live grenade. Castellano was old-school boxing royalty, a former heavyweight contender from the 1980s who'd built his post-fighting career on maintaining the sport's traditions and protecting its established hierarchies. He'd seen the women's boxing movement as a necessary evil, something to be tolerated and contained rather than embraced. The idea of a woman competing in the men's heavyweight division struck him as not just inappropriate, but dangerous. Castellano's initial response had been swift and dismissive. The Commission's official statement read like a form letter. After careful consideration of the petition submitted by Sarah Martinez and her representatives, the International Heavyweight Boxing Commission has determined that existing safety protocols and competitive standards preclude authorization for cross-gender heavyweight competition. The statement included references to protecting fighter welfare and maintaining competitive integrity that barely disguised the real message: stay in your lane. But Elena Rodriguez wasn't easily dismissed. As a physician and commission board member, she had standing to challenge Castellano's decision through formal channels. She'd requested a full hearing, complete with expert testimony and medical evidence, to examine whether the Commission's rejection was based on legitimate safety concerns or outdated prejudices. The hearing had been scheduled for late March, giving Sarah and her team 6 weeks to prepare their case. The boxing world had taken notice. Word of Sarah's petition had leaked to boxing media, creating a firestorm of controversy that split the sport along predictable lines. Established promoters and managers expressed concern about the precedent this might set, worried that allowing women into men's divisions would complicate their business model and threaten the masculine identity of heavyweight boxing. Younger fighters and progressive voices in the sport rallied to Sarah's cause, arguing that boxing had always been about individual merit rather than demographic categories. Sarah herself remained focused on training, while lawyers and commissioners debated the theoretical implications of her case. She was in the gym at 5 every morning, working on the technical improvements that would make her petition irrelevant. She knew that all the legal arguments in the world wouldn't matter if she couldn't prove her point in the ring. The goal wasn't just to gain admission to the heavyweight division, but to win it, to become so undeniably excellent that future debates about size and gender in boxing would reference her name as the standard. Maria had structured Sarah's training camp like preparation for the most important fight of her career, because in many ways it was. Every sparring session was recorded and analyzed, every improvement documented as potential evidence for the commission hearing. They'd brought in male sparring partners who outweighed Sarah by 40 to 60 pounds. Elite amateur heavyweights who could simulate the size and power she'd face if granted professional opportunities. The results had been remarkable. Sarah adapted to fighting larger opponents with an ease that surprised even Maria. Her speed advantage was more pronounced against bigger fighters, her technical superiority more apparent when facing opponents who relied on size rather than skill. She'd knocked down sparring partners who'd never been hurt by fighters their own size, using combinations and angles that bigger fighters couldn't anticipate or counter. The underground boxing community had become Sarah's unofficial support network. Fighters who'd never spoken to her began showing up at Santa's gym to watch her train, offering encouragement and sharing stories of their own battles against boxing's rigid hierarchies. Former professionals who'd been overlooked by promoters or marginalized by the sport's politics saw Sarah's fight as their fight, a chance to challenge the gatekeepers who decided who belonged in boxing's upper echelons. Word of Sarah's abilities had spread beyond Chicago's boxing scene. Videos of her training sessions, carefully edited to showcase her most impressive moments, had gone viral on social media. Boxing fans who'd never heard of the International Heavyweight Boxing Commission were suddenly following her story, creating a groundswell of public support that put pressure on boxing's establishment to address her petition seriously. The meat packing plant had become Sarah's sanctuary during this period of uncertainty. The repetitive physical work allowed her mind to process the magnitude of what she was attempting, while the anonymity of the factory floor provided relief from the growing media attention surrounding her case. Her co-workers had begun to piece together that their quiet colleague was becoming famous, but they respected her privacy and treated her the same as always. Late at night, after finishing her shift and before beginning her morning training session, Sarah would sit in her apartment with a cup of coffee and study video footage of current heavyweight champions. She analyzed their footwork, their defensive habits, their tendency to drop their hands after throwing combinations. She memorized their favorite punch sequences and identified the openings that a faster, more technical fighter might exploit. This wasn't idle fantasy. This was professional preparation for opportunities she was determined to create. Commissioner Castellano had spent the weeks following Sarah's petition consulting with every ally he could find in boxing's power structure. Old guard promoters assured him that allowing women into men's divisions would destroy the sport's commercial appeal. Veteran trainers expressed concern about the safety implications of size mismatches. Medical consultants provided opinions that supported traditional weight class restrictions. But Castellano was also receiving pressure from unexpected sources. Major television networks had expressed interest in broadcasting Sarah's potential debut fight, recognizing the massive audience that would tune in to watch boxing history being made. Younger commission members had begun questioning whether the organization's resistance to change was making it look antiquated and discriminatory. Even some heavyweight champions had publicly stated they'd be willing to fight Sarah if the commission approved her petition. The hearings were set to begin in 10 days, and Sarah knew this was her moment to prove that size had never been the true measure of a heavyweight champion. Everything she'd worked for, everything her grandfather had taught her, everything Maria had sacrificed to train her, came down to convincing a room full of men that she belonged in their division, not as a novelty, but as a legitimate threat to everyone in it. The commission hearing room felt like a courtroom designed to intimidate rather than illuminate. Dark wood paneling stretched from floor to ceiling, adorned with portraits of boxing legends whose stern faces seemed to judge anyone who dared challenge tradition. Commissioner Frank Castellano sat at the center of a curved mahogany table, flanked by 8 other commission members whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. The overhead lighting cast harsh shadows that made the room feel smaller and more oppressive than its actual dimensions warranted. Sarah entered wearing her only suit, a navy blue ensemble she'd purchased at a discount store specifically for this occasion. The fabric was synthetic and the cut was unflattering, but it was clean and professional, which was all she could afford. Maria Santos walked beside her, carrying a briefcase filled with medical reports, training videos, and documentation that represented months of preparation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had arrived earlier and was already seated at the witness table, her laptop open and ready to present the scientific evidence that would support their case. The gallery behind them was packed with an unusual mix of spectators. Boxing reporters sat alongside women's rights advocates, underground fighters mixed with commission staffers, and television producers discreetly filmed everything despite official restrictions on cameras. The energy in the room was electric, with anticipation, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing a potential turning point in boxing history. Castellano called the session to order with a gavel that sounded like a gunshot in the acoustically perfect chamber. His opening statement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic condescension, acknowledging Sarah's impressive amateur record, while emphasizing the commission's sacred responsibility to protect fighter safety and maintain competitive integrity. He spoke about boxing's proud traditions, the wisdom of weight classes, and the dangerous precedent that might be set by abandoning established protocols. Dr. Rodriguez was called as the first witness, and her presentation was methodical and devastating. She'd spent weeks analyzing video footage of Sarah's fights, comparing her punch output, defensive movements, and ring generalship to established heavyweight champions. The data was irrefutable. Sarah's technical skills exceeded those of most professional heavyweights. Her conditioning was superior to fighters 30 pounds heavier, and her knockout percentage was higher than any current champion in any weight division. The medical evidence was particularly compelling. Rodriguez had conducted extensive testing of Sarah's bone density, muscle fiber composition, and cardiovascular capacity. Despite her smaller frame, Sarah's skeletal structure was denser than average, providing natural protection against impact that compensated for her size disadvantage. Her fast-twitch muscle fibers comprised 68% of her total muscle mass, compared to 45% for typical heavyweights, explaining her exceptional power generation. Her VO2 max scored in the 99th percentile for all athletes, male or female, indicating cardiovascular fitness that would allow her to maintain peak performance longer than opponents who relied on size rather than conditioning. Commission. Member Dr. James Patterson, a sports medicine specialist who'd been skeptical of Sarah's petition, found himself asking increasingly technical questions about Rodriguez's methodology. The data was so comprehensive and professionally presented that dismissing it would require ignoring established scientific principles. Patterson's questions evolved from challenging the research to understanding its implications, a shift that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Maria Santos testified next, bringing 3 decades of boxing experience to bear on Sarah's case. She spoke about the evolution of fighting styles, how technical precision had always trumped raw size among elite fighters, and the arbitrary nature of weight class divisions that had more to do with marketing than athletic performance. Her testimony included anecdotes about legendary fighters who'd succeeded despite size disadvantages, historical examples of boxing's flexibility when commercial interests aligned with competitive merit, and detailed analysis of current heavyweight champions whose vulnerabilities perfectly matched Sarah's strengths. The most powerful moment of Maria's testimony came when she addressed the commission's safety concerns directly. She'd brought video evidence of Sarah sparring with male heavyweights, footage that showed her not just surviving but dominating opponents who outweighed her significantly. In one particularly striking sequence, Sarah had knocked down a 6'4" amateur heavyweight with a combination that lasted less than 3 seconds, demonstrating reflexes and precision that made size irrelevant. Castellano's questioning of Maria revealed his growing desperation to find flaws in their preparation. He pressed her about Sarah's limited professional experience, her lack of exposure to elite competition, and the potential liability issues if she were seriously injured by a larger opponent. Maria's responses were patient but firm, pointing out that every professional fighter began with limited experience, that Sarah's amateur record exceeded that of most heavyweight champions before turning professional, and that boxing had always involved calculated risks that participants accepted voluntarily. The commission's medical consultant, Dr. William Hayes, presented the opposition's case with arguments that felt increasingly thin as the hearing progressed. He spoke about statistical injury rates, theoretical biomechanical disadvantages, and historical precedents for maintaining traditional divisions. But his testimony lacked the specificity and rigor of Rodriguez's presentation, relying instead on generalities and assumptions that crumbled under detailed questioning. Sarah herself was called to testify late in the afternoon, and her presence transformed the atmosphere in the room. She spoke quietly but with absolute conviction about her boxing journey, her training regimen, and her understanding of the risks involved in professional competition. When Castellano pressed her about potential injuries from fighting larger opponents, Sarah's response was simple and devastating. "Commissioner, I've been knocking out men bigger than me since I was 16 years old. The only thing that's changed is now I want to do it professionally." The turning point came when Commission member Angela Foster, the only woman on the panel, asked Sarah directly why heavyweight boxing mattered to her when women's divisions offered legitimate professional opportunities. Sarah's answer cut through months of legal maneuvering and political positioning with stark honesty. She explained that heavyweight boxing represented the pinnacle of the sport, that true champions sought the highest level of competition regardless of convenience, and that she'd spent her entire life preparing for challenges that others considered impossible. Foster's follow-up question proved decisive. "Ms. Martinez, if the Commission grants your petition and you fail to prove yourself against elite competition, will you accept responsibility for potentially damaging opportunities for future female fighters?" Sarah's response was immediate and unflinching. "Ma'am, if I fail, it won't be because I'm a woman or because I'm too small. It'll be because I wasn't good enough. And if I'm not good enough, then I don't deserve to be there." The hearing concluded with closing arguments that felt anticlimactic after Sarah's testimony. The commissioners deliberated for 2 hours while Sarah, Maria, and Elena waited in a nearby conference room, picking at sandwiches and avoiding the topic that dominated everyone's thoughts. Media representatives crowded the hallway outside, their cameras and microphones creating a gauntlet that Sarah would have to navigate regardless of the decision. When the commissioners reconvened, Castellano's expression revealed nothing about their conclusion. He spoke about the unprecedented nature of Sarah's petition, the Commission's careful consideration of all evidence presented, and their commitment to both innovation and safety in professional boxing. The actual decision came buried in bureaucratic language that took several sentences to decode. Sarah's petition was approved for a provisional professional license, contingent on passing additional medical evaluations and agreeing to enhanced safety protocols for her first professional bout. The explosion of camera flashes and shouted questions that followed the announcement created chaos in the previously dignified hearing room. Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters asking about her training plans, her choice of opponents, and her expectations for professional success. Maria and Elena flanked her protectively, helping her navigate questions she wasn't prepared to answer while emotions she'd suppressed for months finally surfaced. The provisional nature of her license meant Sarah would need to prove herself quickly and convincingly. The Commission had essentially placed her on probation, granting permission to compete while reserving the right to revoke her license if her performance didn't meet unstated standards. It was conditional acceptance designed to satisfy legal requirements while providing easy justification for future rejection if her boxing didn't live up to the hype surrounding her petition. Outside the Commission building, Sarah faced her first professional press conference in the parking lot, with downtown Chicago's skyline providing a dramatic backdrop for the impromptu media event. Questions came rapidly and relentlessly. Who would she fight first? When would the bout take place? Did she really believe she could compete with established heavyweights? How did it feel to make boxing history? Sarah's answers were measured and professional, but her underlying confidence was unmistakable. She spoke about respecting her future opponents, while making it clear she feared none of them. She acknowledged the historic nature of her situation, while emphasizing her focus on competitive success rather than symbolic gestures. Most importantly, she expressed gratitude for the opportunity, while making it obvious she intended to earn everything that came next. The boxing world's reaction to Sarah's provisional license was swift and polarized. Established promoters expressed cautious interest, recognizing the commercial potential of her story while questioning whether she could deliver competitive fights that would justify the media attention. Young fighters and progressive voices in the sport celebrated her victory as long overdue recognition of merit over prejudice. Traditional boxing media treated her success as either a dangerous precedent or an inevitable evolution, depending on their editorial stance. More crucially, potential opponents began positioning themselves for what everyone recognized would be the most watched heavyweight debut in decades. Journeyman fighters saw Sarah as an opportunity for career-defining exposure, while established contenders worried that losing to her would damage their reputations irreparably. The politics of opponent selection would prove almost as complex as gaining commission approval had been. Maria and Sarah spent the evening after the hearing planning the next phase of their campaign. Professional boxing operated according to different rules than amateur competition, requiring connections with promoters, managers, and television networks that they'd never needed before. They would need to navigate political relationships and commercial considerations while maintaining focus on the athletic preparation that had brought them this far. The commission's provisional license came with specific requirements that would shape Sarah's professional debut. She would need to undergo additional medical testing every 30 days, submit to enhanced pre-fight examinations, and agree to immediate post-fight medical evaluation regardless of bout outcome. These requirements were presented as safety measures, but they also served as potential justification for license revocation if commission members decided they'd made a mistake. Sarah's first opponent would be crucial for establishing her professional credibility. Too weak an opponent would be dismissed as a publicity stunt, while too strong an opponent could end her career before it truly began. Maria had already begun researching potential matches, looking for fighters whose styles would showcase Sarah's abilities while providing legitimate competition that would satisfy skeptics. The pressure was immense, but Sarah felt more focused than she had in months. The uncertainty about whether she'd be allowed to compete had been replaced by the clearer challenge of proving she belonged among professional heavyweights. She understood that her provisional license was essentially a trial period, but she also knew that successful performance in the ring would make her position unassailable. Frank Castellano watched the media coverage of Sarah's provisional license with growing unease. He'd hoped that granting limited approval would satisfy her advocates while providing easy justification for future restrictions if her performance disappointed. Instead, the boxing world was treating her provisional license as complete vindication of her abilities, creating momentum that would be difficult to stop even if her professional debut proved unsuccessful. The politics within the commission had shifted dramatically during the hearing process. Members who'd initially supported Castellano's resistance to Sarah's petition had been swayed by the quality of evidence presented and the growing public interest in her story. Angela Foster had emerged as Sarah's strongest advocate among commissioners, using her influence to ensure that provisional license requirements were reasonable rather than prohibitive. Alina Rodriguez had begun working on a comprehensive study of Sarah's transition to professional boxing, documenting her training methods, fight preparation, and competitive results for potential publication in sports medicine journals. The scientific community was watching Sarah's case with interest that extended beyond boxing, seeing her success or failure as data relevant to broader questions about athletic performance and gender in sports. The Santa's Underground Boxing Gym had become a pilgrimage site for boxing fans and media representatives wanting to observe Sarah's professional training. Maria had been forced to implement security measures and limit access to prevent disruption of Sarah's preparation, but the attention was also attracting sponsorship opportunities that could provide financial stability for the first time in either woman's career. Sarah's story had resonated beyond boxing circles, inspiring athletes in other sports who faced their own barriers based on size, gender, or unconventional backgrounds. Letters and messages of support arrived daily from people who saw her fight as representative of their own struggles against institutional limitations. This broader cultural impact added pressure to succeed, but it also provided motivation that transcended simple competitive ambition. The meat packing plant where Sarah continued working overnight shifts had become an unlikely symbol of her authenticity. While other professional fighters trained at expensive facilities and lived off sponsorship money, Sarah maintained her day job and trained in a converted warehouse, creating a narrative of working-class determination that resonated with boxing fans who remembered when the sport celebrated such backgrounds. As winter turned to spring in Chicago, Sarah's training intensified in preparation for her professional debut. Every aspect of her preparation was scrutinized and documented, from her nutrition plan to her sparring sessions to her psychological preparation for the pressure of professional competition. The boxing world was watching, waiting to see whether the woman who'd forced her way into heavyweight boxing could prove she belonged there. Commissioner Castellano's concerns about precedent were proving justified, as female fighters in other weight classes began filing their own petitions to compete. In men's divisions, Sarah's provisional license had opened a door that the boxing establishment wasn't prepared to manage, creating administrative and political challenges that extended far beyond her individual case. The date for Sarah's professional debut was set for late May, giving her 2 months to complete preparation while allowing sufficient time for promotion and ticket sales. The opponent selection process had narrowed to 3 potential candidates, each representing different strategic approaches to establishing her professional credibility. The choice would determine not just her first professional fight, but the trajectory of her entire career. Maria Santos felt the weight of responsibility for guiding Sarah through this transition. Every decision, from training methods to media appearances to opponent selection, would be scrutinized and judged by people who were eager to see either spectacular success or devastating failure. The margin for error was non-existent, but the opportunity was historic. Dr. Elena Rodriguez continued her documentation of Sarah's case, recognizing that the scientific and medical data being generated would influence athletic policy decisions for decades. Whether Sarah succeeded or failed, the comprehensive analysis of her abilities and performance would provide evidence for future athletes challenging traditional barriers in professional sports. The boxing world held its breath as Sarah Martinez prepared to prove that she belonged among heavyweight champions. Her provisional license was just the beginning of a journey that would test everything she'd learned about fighting, everything Maria had taught her about competition, and everything they both believed about the relationship between size and ability in professional boxing. The commission had given her permission to try. Now she had to prove she deserved to succeed. The Golden Gloves Training Academy occupied an entire city block in downtown Chicago, its glass facade and state-of-the-art equipment representing everything that separated elite professional boxing from the underground world, where Sarah had learned her craft. Inside, million-dollar fighters trained under the guidance of celebrity coaches, their every movement monitored by sports scientists and nutritionists who commanded salaries larger than most people's annual income. This was where Victor, the Destroyer, Petrov had built his reputation as the most feared heavyweight in the world, and where Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how different professional boxing could be from anything she'd experienced. The invitation to train at Golden Gloves had come from Marcus Webb, a prominent boxing manager who specialized in developing heavyweight prospects for major television networks. Webb had watched Sarah's commission hearing with the calculating eye of someone who understood that controversy translated directly into pay-per-view revenue. He'd approached Maria Santos with a proposal that seemed almost too good to be true: full access to elite training facilities, professional sparring partners, and promotional support for Sarah's debut fight in exchange for a management contract. That would give him control over her professional career. Maria had been skeptical from the moment Webb's assistant called to arrange the meeting. Managers like Webb didn't typically invest in unproven fighters, especially ones whose success might threaten the established order they'd spent decades cultivating. But Sarah needed professional-level preparation for her debut, and the Santos underground boxing gym, despite its spiritual significance, lacked the resources necessary for elite competition. After extensive discussion and legal review, they'd agreed to a modified arrangement that gave Webb promotional rights while preserving Sarah's autonomy over training decisions. The contrast between Golden Gloves and Santos Underground was immediately apparent when Sarah arrived for her first training session. Where Maria's gym smelled of sweat and determination, Golden Gloves was sanitized and climate-controlled. Where Santos Underground featured mismatched equipment held together by determination and duct tape, Golden Gloves showcased machines that cost more than most people's cars. The fighters training there moved with the confidence of athletes who'd never questioned their right to occupy elite spaces. Sarah's presence disrupted the gym's carefully cultivated atmosphere from the moment she walked through the doors. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as established heavyweights paused their training to stare at the woman who'd forced her way into their exclusive club. Some looks were curious, others hostile, but all carried the weight of judgment from people who'd never had to prove their belonging in professional boxing. Sarah had expected this reaction, but experiencing it in person felt different from imagining it in preparation. Webb had arranged for Sarah to spar with Tommy Thunder Johnson, a journeyman heavyweight with a record of 23 wins and 8 losses, who specialized in preparing elite fighters for important bouts. Johnson was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds, making him an ideal test of Sarah's ability to compete against typical heavyweight dimensions. More importantly, Johnson was known for his technical skills and ring intelligence, qualities that would provide a more accurate assessment of Sarah's readiness than simple size comparison. The sparring session was scheduled for late afternoon, allowing time for word to spread throughout Chicago's boxing community. By 4 o'clock, the gym was packed with fighters, trainers, managers, and media representatives who'd found excuses to witness what many considered either a historic breakthrough or an elaborate publicity stunt. The energy in the room was electric, with anticipation and skepticism in equal measure. Sarah entered the ring wearing borrowed gear that didn't quite fit properly, her movements drawing immediate attention from the experienced eyes watching her warm-up routine. Her shadowboxing displayed the technical precision that had dominated amateur competition, but several veteran trainers noticed subtle adjustments in her stance and punch selection that suggested she'd been preparing specifically for larger opponents. The months of underground preparation were evident in every movement. Johnson's approach to the sparring session was professional but clearly designed to test Sarah's resolve as much as her skills. He used his size advantage aggressively, leaning on her in clinches, pushing her around the ring with his superior weight, and throwing punches with enough force to discourage anyone who didn't belong at the professional level. His strategy was sound. If Sarah couldn't handle physical intimidation from a journeyman, she had no business facing elite heavyweights. The first round revealed the fundamental differences between Sarah's style and traditional heavyweight boxing. While Johnson relied on his size to control distance and timing, Sarah used movement and angles to create opportunities that size couldn't defend against. Her footwork allowed her to attack from positions where Johnson's longer reach became a disadvantage, while her hand speed let her land combinations before he could respond effectively. By the end of the first round, Johnson's confident demeanor had been replaced by focused concentration. The second round showcased Sarah's power in ways that silenced the skeptics in attendance. When Johnson attempted to rough her up in a corner, Sarah exploded out of the clinch with a left hook that sent him stumbling backward, his legs momentarily unsteady beneath him. The punch had been thrown from close range with perfect technique, generating power through hip rotation and timing, rather than arm strength. Johnson's experience allowed him to recover quickly, but everyone present had seen that Sarah's punches carried legitimate knockout potential. The third and final round demonstrated Sarah's conditioning advantage over a fighter who'd relied on size throughout his career. While Johnson's punches became increasingly labored and his movement more predictable, Sarah maintained the same pace and precision she'd shown in round one. Her combinations grew more complex as Johnson's defensive reactions slowed, and she began timing his movements with the confidence of a fighter who understood she belonged in the ring with anyone. When the sparring session ended, the gym fell silent except for the sound of both fighters breathing heavily. Johnson removed his headgear and extended his hand to Sarah with genuine respect, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "That woman can fight. Anyone who says different is lying to themselves." The endorsement from a respected professional carried more weight than any commission, hearing, or media coverage could provide. Webb watched the sparring session with the satisfaction of someone whose commercial instincts had been validated by athletic performance. Sarah's ability to not just compete but dominate a professional heavyweight had transformed her from an interesting story into a legitimate investment opportunity. He began making phone calls before Sarah had finished cooling down, reaching out to television networks and venue promoters who would want to be involved in her professional debut. The reaction from other fighters at Golden Gloves was mixed but revealing. Younger heavyweights who'd watched Sarah dismantle Johnson's game plan expressed open admiration for her skills, recognizing technical ability that exceeded their own despite her size disadvantage. Older, more established fighters maintained skeptical silence, unwilling to publicly endorse someone whose success might diminish their own accomplishments. The politics of professional boxing were evident in every conversation and sideways glance. Maria Santos observed the sparring session from ringside, her experienced eye cataloging every detail of Sarah's performance while monitoring the reactions of industry professionals who would influence her fighter's career trajectory. The validation was satisfying, but Maria understood that one impressive sparring session wouldn't eliminate the systematic resistance Sarah would face throughout her professional career. This was just the beginning of a much longer campaign to prove that merit mattered more than tradition. Dr. Elena Rodriguez documented every aspect of Sarah's Golden Gloves debut for her ongoing research project, noting not just the athletic performance but the social dynamics that surrounded it. The medical data she collected would contribute to broader understanding of gender and size in professional sports. But she also recognized the historic significance of watching barriers fall in real time. Her scientific training helped her maintain objectivity, but her personal investment in Sarah's success was undeniable. The news of Sarah's dominant sparring session spread through boxing circles with the speed of social media amplification. Video clips appeared on platforms throughout the evening, each one viewed thousands of times by fans hungry for evidence that would support their preconceptions about her abilities. The footage was grainy and shot from various angles, but the essential story was clear. Sarah Martinez could compete with and defeat professional heavyweights. Commissioner Frank Castellano received reports of Sarah's Golden Gloves performance, with growing concern about the precedent her success was establishing. Every positive development in her professional preparation made it more difficult to justify the restrictive conditions of her provisional license, while her growing popular support created political pressure that threatened his authority over heavyweight boxing regulation. He began consulting with allies about potential responses to her continued success. The financial implications of Sarah's marketability became apparent when Webb's phone began ringing with calls from sponsors interested in associating their brands with her story. Companies that had never shown interest in boxing recognized the commercial potential of supporting the first woman to compete professionally in heavyweight boxing. The endorsement opportunities represented financial security that could transform not just Sarah's life but the entire ecosystem surrounding women's boxing. Sarah's continued employment at the meat-packing plant became a point of fascination for media covering her story. While other professional fighters lived off promotional advances and sponsorship money, she maintained her overnight job, arriving at Golden Gloves each afternoon, still carrying the industrial smells of her workplace. The contrast between her blue-collar background and the elite training environment created narrative tension that resonated with working-class boxing fans. The selection process for Sarah's professional debut opponent had narrowed to 2 candidates, each representing different strategic approaches to establishing her credibility. The first option was Danny "The Bull" Morrison, a technically limited but physically imposing fighter whose main qualification was his willingness to face someone whose victory might damage his own reputation. The second option was Carlos Mendoza, a skilled boxer with a respectable record who saw facing Sarah as an opportunity to prove his own abilities against unique competition. Maria preferred Mendoza as an opponent because his technical skills would provide a more legitimate test of Sarah's professional readiness, while his respectful attitude toward the historic nature of their potential bout would minimize the circus atmosphere that could overshadow athletic competition. Webb favored Morrison because his intimidating physical presence would create more dramatic television, while his limited skills would reduce the risk of Sarah suffering a damaging loss in her debut. The debate over opponent selection revealed fundamental tensions between athletic and commercial considerations that would define Sarah's professional career. Maria prioritized competitive integrity and long-term development, while Webb focused on immediate commercial success and media attention. Sarah found herself caught between these perspectives, understanding the validity of both approaches, while recognizing that her choice would establish precedents for every decision that followed. The training regimen at Golden Gloves had been customized specifically for Sarah's unique physical attributes and fighting style. Sports scientists analyzed video footage of her movements to optimize conditioning programs that enhanced her natural advantages while addressing potential vulnerabilities against larger opponents. Nutritionists developed meal plans that maximized her power-to-weight ratio while ensuring adequate recovery between intense training sessions. The level of professional support was unlike anything she'd experienced during her amateur career. Sarah's adaptation to professional-level training was remarkable even by the standards of experienced coaches who'd worked with elite athletes throughout their careers. Her work ethic exceeded that of fighters who'd been training professionally for years, while her ability to absorb and implement technical corrections showed an intelligence that couldn't be taught. Most importantly, her confidence grew with each session as repeated success against professional sparring partners convinced her that size had never been the determining factor in heavyweight boxing excellence. The boxing media's coverage of Sarah's Golden Gloves training created a feedback loop that amplified interest in her story while increasing pressure for her professional debut. Every training session was analyzed and discussed by experts who'd never seen anything comparable to her situation. Opinion pieces debated the implications of her success for women's sports, professional boxing, and athletic competition generally. The attention was unprecedented for a fighter who hadn't yet competed professionally. Viktor Petrov's camp had been monitoring Sarah's progress with the interest of champions who understood that public fascination with her story could eventually lead to demands for high-profile fights. Petrov's manager had already received informal inquiries about his client's willingness to face Sarah if she proved herself against lesser competition. The financial incentives were enormous, but the risks to Petrov's reputation were equally significant if he lost to someone the boxing establishment had initially dismissed. The technical improvements in Sarah's game during her time at Golden Gloves were subtle but significant to trained observers. Her defensive positioning had been adjusted to account for the longer reach of typical heavyweights, while her offensive combinations had been refined to maximize damage against opponents who relied on size rather than mobility. Most importantly, her ring generalship had evolved to take advantage of tactical mistakes that larger, less technical fighters typically made when facing unfamiliar opposition. Webb's promotional strategy for Sarah's debut was designed to maximize commercial appeal while establishing her legitimate credentials as a professional heavyweight. The marketing campaign would emphasize both the historic nature of her participation and the athletic merit that had earned her commission approval. Television advertisements would feature footage of her dominating larger sparring partners, while press materials would highlight her amateur accomplishments and the scientific evidence supporting her abilities. The venue selection for Sarah's professional debut required balancing commercial considerations with practical necessities for what was essentially an experimental event. The promoters needed a facility large enough to accommodate the massive media interest while intimate enough to create an electric atmosphere for television broadcasts. After extensive negotiation, they'd settled on the Chicago Theater, a historic venue that could seat 4,000 spectators, while providing the sophisticated production capabilities necessary for pay-per-view coverage. Sarah's final sparring sessions before her professional debut featured increasingly elite opposition as word of her abilities spread throughout the boxing community. Established contenders began volunteering to work with her, some motivated by curiosity about her skills, and others by the commercial opportunities associated with her growing fame. Each session provided additional evidence that she belonged among professional heavyweights, while building confidence that would prove crucial when facing the pressures of professional competition. The announcement of Sarah's professional debut opponent came during a packed press conference at the Chicago Athletic Association, with both fighters flanked by their teams and surrounded by media representatives from around the world. Carlos Mendoza had been selected after extensive negotiation, his combination of technical skills and professional reputation providing the credibility that Sarah needed to establish herself as a legitimate heavyweight contender rather than a novelty act. Mendoza's gracious acceptance of the fight and respectful comments about Sarah's abilities set a tone that elevated the bout above the circus atmosphere that many had feared. His acknowledgement that facing her represented the biggest opportunity of his career, combined with his genuine respect for her accomplishments, created anticipation for a competitive fight that would be decided by athletic merit rather than predetermined by size assumptions. The final weeks before Sarah's professional debut were consumed by media obligations that threatened to overshadow the athletic preparation that would determine her success. Television interviews, magazine photo shoots, and promotional appearances filled her schedule while she attempted to maintain the training intensity necessary for peak performance. The balance between commercial requirements and competitive preparation required careful management from her team. Maria Santos watched these developments with the mixture of pride and concern that defined her relationship with Sarah's professional transition. The validation of everything they'd worked to achieve was deeply satisfying, but the pressures and distractions of commercial success threatened to undermine the focus that had brought them this far. Her job was to ensure that Sarah remained the fighter who dominated amateur competition while adapting to the unique demands of professional boxing. The betting lines for Sarah's debut fight revealed the boxing world's continued uncertainty about her abilities. While her training performances had convinced many experts of her legitimacy, the gambling public remained split between those who saw her as a revolutionary talent and those who believed professional competition would expose the limitations that amateur success had hidden. The odds reflected this division, making the fight one of the most unpredictable heavyweight bouts in recent memory. Dr. Elena Rodriguez prepared for the most comprehensive documentation of any professional boxing debut in medical history, with monitoring equipment that would track every aspect of Sarah's performance and physiological response to professional competition. The data collected would contribute to scientific understanding of athletic performance while providing evidence for future policy decisions about gender and size in professional sports. The research implications extended far beyond boxing into questions about fairness and opportunity in all competitive athletics. As the date of her professional debut approached, Sarah Martinez felt the weight of expectations from people who saw her success or failure as representative of broader Questions about merit, opportunity, and tradition in professional sports. She understood that she was fighting not just for personal achievement, but for the principle that excellence should be recognized regardless of the form it took. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity to prove that belonging was earned through performance rather than granted through prejudice. The Chicago theater hummed with an energy that veterans of boxing promotion had never experienced before. Every seat was filled 90 minutes before the main event, with spectators ranging from boxing purists who'd followed the sport for decades to casual fans drawn by the historic nature of what they were about to witness. The venue's ornate architecture provided an elegant backdrop for what many considered either the evolution of professional boxing or its potential destruction, depending on their perspective regarding tradition and change. Sarah Martinez sat in her dressing room, a converted theater space that had been hastily equipped with the necessities of professional fight preparation. The walls were covered with mirrors that reflected her image from multiple angles, showing a fighter who looked smaller than ever, surrounded by the trappings of heavyweight boxing. Maria Santos worked methodically through the ritual of hand wrapping, her experienced fingers creating the precise tension that would protect Sarah's hands while maximizing the impact of every punch she threw. The atmosphere in the dressing room was deliberately calm, a stark contrast to the chaos building throughout the venue as fight time approached. Sarah had learned to use these quiet moments before competition to visualize every aspect of her performance, mentally rehearsing combinations and defensive movements until they became as automatic as breathing. Tonight's visualization included scenarios she'd never faced before, the unique pressures of professional boxing combined with the weight of expectations from people who saw her as representing something larger than individual athletic achievement. Carlos Mendoza's preparation in the adjacent dressing room followed the routines he'd developed over 8 years of professional competition. But the magnitude of tonight's fight had introduced variables that challenged his usual calm confidence. Losing to Sarah would damage his reputation in ways that defeats to other fighters wouldn't, while winning might be dismissed as inevitable given his size advantage. The no-win nature of his situation had been apparent from the moment he'd agreed to the fight, but the financial compensation and media exposure made it impossible to refuse. Dr. Elena Rodriguez monitored Sarah's pre-fight vital signs with equipment that would provide the most comprehensive physiological data ever collected during a professional boxing debut. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and stress hormone levels were tracked in real time, creating a scientific baseline that would be compared to measurements taken throughout the fight. The data would contribute to medical understanding of athletic performance while documenting the physical demands of breaking barriers in professional sports. Commissioner Frank Castellano watched the pre-fight preparations from a VIP viewing area, his presence serving as both official oversight and personal investment in the outcome. Sarah's provisional license required enhanced medical supervision that went beyond normal professional boxing protocols, giving Castellano additional authority to stop the fight if he determined her safety was compromised. His interpretation of those safety standards would be influenced by his continued skepticism about women competing in heavyweight boxing. The undercard fights had proceeded without incident, featuring local fighters who understood their role in building excitement. For the historic main event, each bout had been competitive enough to maintain audience engagement while avoiding injuries that might delay the evening's featured attraction. The crowd's energy built steadily throughout the preliminary competitions, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that veteran promoters recognized as ideal for pay-per-view success. Marcus Webb orchestrated the final promotional elements with the precision of someone who understood that tonight's fight would define his management company's future as much as Sarah's boxing career. Television interviews, last-minute sponsor obligations, and media coordination required careful timing to ensure that commercial requirements didn't interfere with athletic preparation. The balance between promotion and performance had been delicate throughout Sarah's professional transition, but tonight's success would justify every calculated risk they'd taken. Sarah's final warm-up routine in the dressing room displayed the technical refinements that months of professional training had produced. Her shadowboxing incorporated adjustments specific to Mendoza's fighting style, while her pad work with Maria emphasized combinations that would exploit the tactical weaknesses they'd identified through video analysis. Every movement demonstrated the meticulous preparation that had characterized their approach to this historic opportunity. The walk to the ring through the Chicago theater's narrow corridors felt like a procession through boxing history, with every step taking Sarah closer to a moment that would either validate years of struggle or expose limitations that amateur success had concealed. The crowd's roar grew louder as she approached the arena, their excitement building to levels that seasoned boxing observers hadn't experienced since the sport's golden era. Cameras captured every expression, every gesture, every sign of confidence or nervousness that might hint at the outcome of what everyone understood was more than just another fight. Sarah's ring entrance was choreographed to emphasize both her Mexican heritage and her working-class authenticity, with music that honored her grandfather's legacy while acknowledging the blue-collar determination that had brought her to professional boxing. She wore a robe that Maria had designed specifically for this moment, featuring embroidery that told the story of her journey from warehouse worker to heavyweight contender. The visual presentation was designed to remind everyone present that excellence could emerge from unexpected places. Mendoza's entrance received respectful applause from a crowd that appreciated his willingness to participate in boxing history, even if their emotional investment lay with his opponent. His professional demeanor and obvious physical advantages created the visual contrast that would define the fight's narrative regardless of its competitive outcome. At 6 feet 2 inches and 215 pounds, he represented everything that traditional heavyweight boxing considered ideal, making Sarah's challenge appear even more improbable. The formal introductions took place in a ring that seemed smaller with both fighters present, emphasizing the size differential that had been the central focus of Sarah's entire professional journey. Ring announcer David Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing her surname, delivered presentations that honored both fighters' accomplishments while acknowledging the historic significance of their meeting. His voice carried the gravitas appropriate for a moment that would be remembered regardless of its outcome. The referee's instructions covered standard professional boxing protocols, with additional emphasis on the enhanced safety measures required by Sarah's provisional license. Both fighters acknowledged their understanding of rules that had been modified specifically for this bout, including provisions for immediate medical evaluation if certain impact thresholds were exceeded. The safety requirements were presented as routine precautions, but everyone present understood their potential to influence the fight's outcome through premature stoppage. When the opening bell rang, the Chicago theater fell silent except for the sound of leather gloves meeting flesh and the rhythmic shuffle of feet across canvas. Sarah's first professional round began with careful distance management as both fighters explored each other's timing and defensive reactions. Mendoza's strategy was immediately apparent. Use his reach advantage to control the center of the ring while preventing Sarah from establishing the close-range combinations that had dominated her amateur career. Sarah's response demonstrated the tactical sophistication that professional training had added to her natural abilities. Rather than rushing forward into Mendoza's strength, she used lateral movement and feints to create confusion about her intentions, while gradually closing the distance between them. Her footwork was more complex than anything Mendoza had encountered in previous fights, with angles and timing that made his longer reach less effective than his preparation had suggested. The first significant exchange came midway through the opening round when Sarah slipped under a Mendoza jab and responded with a 3-punch combination to his body that drew audible gasps from the crowd. The speed and precision of her punches were more impressive in person than video footage had suggested, while their impact was evident in Mendoza's immediate defensive reaction. His respect for her power was established within the first 2 minutes of professional competition. Mendoza's corner provided urgent instruction between rounds, emphasizing the need to maintain distance and avoid the close-range exchanges where Sarah's advantages were most apparent. His trainer recognized that traditional heavyweight tactics wouldn't be effective against an opponent whose speed and technical precision exceeded anything they'd prepared for. The adjustment period was costing valuable rounds in a fight where every moment would be scrutinized by experts looking for evidence to support their preconceptions. The second round showcased Sarah's superior conditioning as Mendoza's movement became increasingly predictable under the pressure of constant defensive adjustments. Professional boxing's longer rounds and different pacing revealed fitness advantages that amateur competition hadn't fully displayed. While Mendoza relied on size and strength that would diminish over time, Sarah's technical approach and cardiovascular superiority positioned her to improve as the fight progressed. Sarah's first knockdown of a professional opponent came in the third round with a left hook that landed precisely as Mendoza attempted to clinch his way out of a corner exchange. The punch traveled less than 8 inches but carried the accumulated force of perfect technique and timing that made size irrelevant. Mendoza's legs betrayed him momentarily before his experience allowed him to recover, but the moment's psychological impact was evident in his increasingly cautious approach to engagement. The crowd's reaction to Sarah's knockdown was unlike anything experienced in professional boxing, with sustained applause that continued long enough to interrupt the fight's rhythm. Spectators understood they were witnessing the validation of everything Sarah had claimed about her abilities, while Mendoza's corner recognized that their fighter was facing something unprecedented in his professional experience. The tactical adjustments that had served him well against traditional heavyweights were proving inadequate against Sarah's unique combination of skills. Commissioner Castellano observed the fight's progression with growing concern about the precedent being established by Sarah's dominant performance. Every successful round made it more difficult to justify the restrictive conditions of her provisional license, while her obvious superiority over a respected professional heavyweight challenged fundamental assumptions about size requirements. In boxing, his authority over the sport's regulations was being undermined by the evidence unfolding in the ring before thousands of witnesses. The middle rounds of the fight demonstrated Sarah's tactical intelligence as she systematically dismantled Mendoza's defensive strategies while avoiding the desperate counterattacks of a fighter who recognized his disadvantage. Her combinations became more complex as his reactions became more predictable, with punch sequences that showcased years of technical development under Maria's guidance. The artistic beauty of her boxing was as impressive as its effectiveness, creating moments of athletic poetry that transcended simple competitive achievement. Mendoza's corner considered stopping the fight after the 6th round, recognizing that their fighter was absorbing punishment that served no constructive purpose while providing Sarah with additional evidence of her professional capabilities. Only pride and financial considerations kept him on his stool for the 7th round, where Sarah's patience finally gave way to the killer instinct that had characterized her amateur career. The end came suddenly, with a combination that began with a jab to create space and finished with a right hand that Mendoza never saw coming. The knockout was clean and decisive, with Mendoza unconscious before he hit the canvas in a way that left no doubt about the outcome or its legitimacy. Sarah's celebration was subdued, recognizing the magnitude of what she'd accomplished while showing respect for an opponent who'd given her the opportunity to prove herself at the professional level. The referee's count was academic, but he completed it anyway, his voice barely audible over the crowd's sustained explosion of appreciation. Dr. Rodriguez's immediate post-fight medical evaluation of Sarah revealed physiological readings that challenged conventional understanding of athletic performance under extreme pressure. Her heart rate, stress hormone levels, and recovery metrics were superior to those typically recorded from heavyweight champions, suggesting that her body was better adapted to professional boxing than anyone had anticipated. The scientific data provided objective validation for subjective observations about her exceptional abilities. The post-fight interviews took place in a ring still, buzzing with the energy of what everyone present understood was a historic moment. In professional boxing, Sarah's comments were gracious and professional, acknowledging Mendoza's courage while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to compete at the highest level of her sport. Her demeanor was that of someone who understood she'd proven a point while recognizing that much work remained to be done. Marcus Webb's immediate post-fight calculations revealed financial possibilities that exceeded his most optimistic projections for Sarah's commercial potential. Pay-per-view numbers were breaking records for non-championship fights, while social media engagement suggested an audience that extended far beyond traditional boxing demographics. The commercial validation of Sarah's story created opportunities for endorsements, television appearances, and future fights that would transform her financial situation while elevating women's boxing generally. Commissioner Castellano's post-fight statement acknowledged Sarah's impressive performance, while emphasizing the Commission's continued commitment to thorough evaluation of her provisional license status. His carefully neutral language concealed growing recognition that her athletic achievements had made restrictive conditions increasingly difficult to justify. The political pressure created by her success was forcing institutional changes that he'd spent months trying to prevent. The boxing media's immediate coverage of Sarah's professional debut was unanimously positive, with veteran writers comparing her performance to legendary debuts in heavyweight history while acknowledging the unique barriers she'd overcome to reach this moment. Opinion pieces published within hours of the fight's conclusion declared her victory a turning point for professional boxing, with implications that extended beyond individual achievement to questions of fairness and opportunity. In professional athletics, Sarah's return to the Santos Underground Boxing Gym the morning after her professional debut was deliberately low-key, a conscious choice to maintain connection with the community that had supported her throughout her amateur career. The familiar surroundings provided psychological comfort after the overwhelming experience of professional competition, while Maria's presence offered continuity with the values that had guided their relationship from the beginning. The flood of fight offers that arrived in the days following Sarah's debut created opportunities and challenges that required careful navigation to ensure her long-term success rather than short-term commercial exploitation. Established contenders who'd previously dismissed her began expressing interest in potential matches, recognizing both the financial benefits and competitive legitimacy that fighting her would provide. The selection of her next opponent would be crucial for establishing her trajectory toward championship opportunities. Viktor Petrov's public acknowledgement of Sarah's abilities represented a watershed moment in heavyweight boxing's acceptance of her legitimacy as a professional competitor. The champion's statement that he would welcome the opportunity to face any qualified challenger was interpreted as implicit recognition that Sarah belonged among the division's elite contenders. His willingness to consider facing her represented validation from the pinnacle of professional heavyweight boxing. The institutional changes that followed Sarah's successful debut extended far beyond individual recognition to systematic reforms in how boxing commissions evaluated license applications and competitive qualifications. Her case became a template for addressing similar petitions from other athletes challenging traditional barriers, while the medical and performance data collected during her fights informed policy decisions that would affect future generations of competitors. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's comprehensive analysis of Sarah's professional debut was published in multiple medical journals, providing scientific validation for conclusions about athletic performance that extended beyond boxing to broader questions about gender and size in professional sports. The research established evidence-based criteria for evaluating athletic capability that prioritized measurable performance over demographic assumptions, influencing policy decisions in sports organizations worldwide. Maria Santos reflected on Sarah's transformation from amateur prospect to professional contender with satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement to vindication of training methods and philosophical approaches that had been dismissed by boxing's establishment. Her guidance had proven that technical excellence and intelligent preparation could overcome any physical disadvantage, while demonstrating that unconventional fighters could succeed at the highest levels of professional competition when given legitimate opportunities. Sarah's continued employment at the meatpacking plant became a symbol of authenticity that distinguished her from other professional athletes who'd lost connection with their working-class origins. Her decision to maintain her overnight job, despite newfound financial opportunities, resonated with fans who appreciated that success hadn't changed her fundamental character or forgotten the community that had supported her rise to prominence. The ripple effects of Sarah's breakthrough extended to amateur boxing programs across the country, where young female fighters found new motivation and support for pursuing competitive excellence without artificial limitations. Gyms that had previously focused exclusively on male fighters began recruiting female prospects, while coaching education programs incorporated lessons learned from Sarah's development about maximizing potential regardless of conventional expectations. Commissioner Castellano's eventual resignation from the International Heavyweight Boxing Commission was presented as a retirement decision, but industry observers understood it as acknowledgement that his resistance to progressive change had become untenable. His replacement, Dr. Patricia Williams, brought a medical background and commitment to evidence-based policy that reflected the Commission's evolution toward more inclusive and scientifically informed governance. The Santos Underground Boxing Gym's transformation into a pilgrimage site for aspiring fighters reflected boxing's recognition that excellence could emerge from unexpected places when supported by proper guidance and unwavering determination. Maria's training methods, previously dismissed as unconventional, became subjects of study for coaches seeking to develop fighters who could compete through technical precision rather than physical advantages. Sarah's first championship opportunity came sooner than anyone had anticipated, with multiple sanctioning bodies recognizing her exceptional abilities and commercial appeal as justification for accelerated title contention. The negotiations for a championship fight required balancing competitive merit with promotional considerations, ensuring that her shot at a title would be earned through performance rather than granted through sympathy or novelty. The legacy of Sarah Martinez's journey from warehouse worker to heavyweight contender became a case study in institutional change and individual perseverance that inspired athletes across all sports who faced their own barriers to participation and recognition. Her story proved that excellence could not be contained by artificial limitations, while demonstrating that systematic change was possible when individuals refused to accept that tradition justified exclusion. The final chapter of Sarah's story was still being written as she prepared for championship competition that would determine whether her breakthrough represented temporary disruption or permanent evolution in professional boxing. Her success had already transformed the sport's understanding of what was possible, while inspiring countless others to challenge assumptions about their own limitations and fight for opportunities that others claimed they didn't deserve. The roar inside Soldier Field was deafening as 65,000 spectators rose to their feet, witnessing something that would be replayed in boxing highlight reels for generations to come. Victor, the Destroyer Petrov, the most feared heavyweight champion in the world, lay motionless on the canvas while Sarah Martinez stood in the center of the ring, her arms raised toward the Chicago night sky. The same woman they had said was too small to belong in heavyweight boxing had just delivered a knockout punch that would redefine everything the sport thought it knew about size, power, and what it meant to be a champion. The journey to this moment had taken 18 months from Sarah's professional debut to earning a shot at the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. Her path had been unlike any other in boxing history, marked by systematic destruction of every argument, used to justify her exclusion from elite competition. After demolishing Carlos Mendoza in her debut, she had methodically worked through a series of increasingly credible contenders, each victory building irrefutable evidence that her success was no accident or publicity stunt. Her second professional fight had come against Antonio "the Brick Wall" Rodriguez, a former title challenger known for his granite chin and relentless pressure fighting. Rodriguez had entered the ring confident that his experience and physical advantages would expose whatever weaknesses Mendoza had failed to exploit. Instead, Sarah had systematically picked him apart over 10 rounds, landing combinations with surgical precision while avoiding nearly every significant punch he threw. The unanimous decision victory had been so one-sided that even Rodriguez's corner admitted they had never seen anything like her performance. The third fight had presented Sarah's biggest test yet when she faced Marcus the Mountain Thompson, a 6'6" giant who weighed 245 pounds and possessed knockout power that had ended 12 of his last 15 fights. Thompson's camp had been supremely confident, believing that size and power would finally prove decisive against Sarah's technical approach. The fight had lasted exactly 97 seconds, ending when Sarah's perfectly timed uppercut caught Thompson leaning forward and sent him crashing to the canvas in a heap that took several minutes to untangle. Each victory had brought Sarah closer to the championship opportunity that everyone in boxing knew was inevitable. But the politics surrounding a potential title fight had proven more complex than anyone anticipated. The major sanctioning bodies had initially resisted mandating a championship bout, claiming that Sarah needed more experience despite her perfect professional record and dominant performances. Behind the scenes, powerful promoters and television executives had lobbied against a title fight, fearing that Sarah's victory would disrupt the established order they had spent decades building. The breakthrough had come when Viktor Petrov himself had publicly demanded the fight, recognizing that his legacy would be incomplete without facing the challenger who had captivated the boxing world. Petrov was a fighter's fighter, a technical perfectionist who had held the heavyweight title for 3 years, while cleaning out the division's traditional contenders. His willingness to face Sarah had been motivated partly by competitive pride, and partly by recognition that defeating her convincingly would silence critics who suggested he was avoiding legitimate challenges. The build-up to the championship fight had been unlike anything in modern boxing history, with media coverage that extended far beyond traditional sports audiences to encompass cultural and social commentary about barriers, achievement, and the evolving nature of professional athletics. Sarah's story had resonated with people who had never watched boxing before, creating a television audience that promoters estimated would exceed 100 million viewers worldwide. The weight of expectation surrounding the championship fight had been immense, but Sarah's preparation had been meticulous and comprehensive. Maria Santos had assembled a team of specialists that included former heavyweight champions, Olympic-level conditioning coaches, and sports psychologists who understood the unique pressures of fighting for a world title while carrying the hopes of people who saw her success as representative of something larger than individual achievement. Training camp for the Petrov fight had taken place at a secluded facility in the Colorado mountains, where Sarah could focus on preparation without the constant media attention that had surrounded her previous fights. The altitude training had enhanced her already superior cardiovascular conditioning, while the isolation had allowed her to develop tactical approaches specific to Petrov's sophisticated fighting style. Sparring partners had been carefully selected, to simulate different aspects of the champion's abilities, from his precise jab to his devastating body punching to his championship-level ring intelligence. The final weeks before the championship fight had been consumed with promotional obligations that tested Sarah's ability to maintain competitive focus while satisfying commercial requirements that came with the sport's biggest stage. Television interviews, magazine photo shoots, and public appearances had filled her schedule, but Maria had carefully managed these commitments to ensure they enhanced rather than detracted from her fighting preparation. Every media interaction had been an opportunity to demonstrate the professionalism and intelligence that distinguished her from fighters who relied solely on physical attributes. Viktor Petrov's own preparation for the fight had been complicated by the unprecedented nature of facing a female challenger, requiring adjustments to training methods and tactical approaches that had served him well throughout his championship reign. His team had studied hundreds of hours of video footage from Sarah's amateur and professional careers, looking for patterns and weaknesses that previous opponents had failed to exploit. What they had discovered was a fighter whose technical skills and tactical intelligence exceeded those of anyone Petrov had faced as champion. The champion's respect for Sarah's abilities had grown throughout the preparation process, as video analysis revealed subtle improvements in her performance with each professional fight. Her footwork had become more complex, her defensive positioning more sophisticated, and her offensive combinations more varied and unpredictable. Most concerning for Petrov's team was evidence that Sarah had developed specific counters for tactics that had been successful against other elite heavyweights. The weigh-in ceremony 2 days before the fight had provided the starkest visual representation of the size differential that had defined Sarah's entire professional journey. Standing next to Petrov on the scale, she appeared almost fragile at 168 pounds compared to his 237 pounds, a 69-pound difference that seemed to make the upcoming fight appear almost unfair. But Sarah's confidence was unmistakable as she stared directly into the champion's eyes during their face-off, showing no intimidation despite the obvious physical mismatch. The Chicago sports community had embraced the championship fight with enthusiasm that transcended typical local support for hometown athletes. Sarah's story had become part of the city's identity, representing the blue-collar determination and refusal to accept limitations that Chicagoans saw as fundamental to their character. Local businesses had closed early on fight night, while viewing parties at bars and community centers had created a citywide celebration that felt more like a festival than a sporting event. Soldier Field had been transformed into a boxing cathedral for the championship fight, with production values that reflected the historic nature of the event. The temporary seating and ring setup had been designed to create an intimate atmosphere despite the massive venue, while lighting and camera positioning had been optimized to capture every moment of what everyone expected would be either the crowning of boxing's most unlikely champion or the validation of traditional heavyweight requirements. Sarah's walk to the ring had been a journey through boxing history, with every step carrying the weight of everyone who had been told they didn't belong in elite competition. The crowd's reception had been unlike anything witnessed at a heavyweight championship fight, with sustained applause that continued for nearly 10 minutes as she made her way from the dressing room to the ring. Signs throughout the arena had displayed messages of support in multiple languages, reflecting the international audience that had been drawn to her story. The champion's entrance had been more subdued but equally powerful, with Petrov carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a professional fight and intended to maintain that record. His team had surrounded him with the disciplined professionalism that had characterized his entire championship reign, while his demeanor had suggested complete focus on the tactical challenges presented by his unprecedented opponent. The formal introductions had taken place in a ring that seemed almost too small to contain the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Ring announcer Michael Buffer had delivered presentations that honored both fighters' accomplishments while acknowledging The historic significance of the first woman to challenge for the undisputed heavyweight championship. His voice had carried appropriate gravitas for a moment that would be remembered regardless of its outcome, while the crowd's response had created an atmosphere of anticipation that veteran observers had never experienced. The referee's final instructions had covered standard championship protocols with additional emphasis on the enhanced medical supervision that accompanied any fight involving Sarah, though the restrictions that had marked her early professional career had been largely eliminated following her dominant performances against elite contenders. Both fighters had acknowledged their understanding of rules that had become routine, while their body language had suggested complete readiness for the most important 15 rounds of their respective careers. When the opening bell had rung, the initial exchanges had revealed immediately that this fight would be different from anything either fighter had experienced before. Petrov's strategy had been apparent from the first minute: use his size and reach advantages to control distance while preventing Sarah from establishing the close-range combinations that had destroyed her previous opponents. His jab had been particularly effective early, snapping Sarah's head back while keeping her at arm's length where her power would be minimized. Sarah's response had demonstrated the tactical sophistication that 18 months of professional competition had developed. Rather than rushing forward into Petrov's strength, she had used patient pressure and lateral movement to gradually break down his defensive positioning while studying his reaction patterns. Her footwork had been more complex than anything Petrov had encountered, creating angles that made his longer reach less effective, while setting up counterpunching opportunities that hadn't existed against previous opponents. The first significant moment had come in the third round when Sarah's patient pressure had finally created an opening for her signature left hook. The punch had landed cleanly on Petrov's temple, causing his legs to buckle momentarily before his championship experience had allowed him to recover. But the psychological impact had been evident immediately, as the champion's previously confident demeanor had been replaced by the focused caution of someone who understood he was facing legitimate danger. Petrov's corner had provided urgent instruction between rounds, emphasizing the need to maintain discipline and avoid the emotional mistakes that Sarah's style was designed to provoke. His trainer had recognized that traditional heavyweight tactics would be insufficient against an opponent whose speed and precision exceeded anything they had prepared for, requiring constant tactical adjustments that were costing valuable rounds in a fight where every moment would be crucial. The middle rounds had showcased Sarah's superior conditioning as Petrov's movement had become increasingly predictable under the pressure of constant defensive adjustments. Championship fights demanded different fitness levels than regular competition, but Sarah's preparation had been so thorough that she had actually improved as the fight progressed. Her combinations had become more complex as Petrov's reactions had slowed, while her defensive positioning had remained sharp despite absorbing occasional power punches from the champion. The tactical turning point had come in the 8th round, when Sarah had begun timing Petrov's jab with counterpunches that landed simultaneously with his attack, neutralizing his primary weapon while establishing her own offensive rhythm. The exchange rate had gradually shifted in her favor as Petrov's frustration had mounted, his disciplined game plan giving way to the desperation of a champion who recognized his title was slipping away. Petrov's championship heart had been evident. In the 10th round, when he had mounted his most sustained offensive of the fight, landing several hard shots that had temporarily stunned Sarah and created the kind of crisis moment that separated champions from contenders. But Sarah's response had been immediate and devastating, using Petrov's aggressive approach against him with a counter combination that had sent the champion stumbling backward into the ropes. The sequence had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had marked the psychological moment when both fighters had understood that Sarah was not just competing but winning. The 11th round had been dominated by Sarah's technical superiority as Petrov's championship conditioning had finally begun to show signs of wear under the pressure of constantly Adjusting to her unpredictable attack patterns, her jab had found its target with increasing frequency, while her body work had been methodically breaking down the champion's defensive structure. Most importantly, her confidence had been building with each successful exchange, while Petrov's belief in his invincibility had been visibly eroding. The beginning of the end had come in the 12th round when Sarah's perfectly timed uppercut had caught Petrov moving forward, snapping his head back with force that had momentarily frozen his entire body. The punch had been thrown from close range with textbook technique, generating power through perfect hip rotation and timing that made size irrelevant. Petrov had remained standing, but his legs had betrayed him for several seconds before his championship experience had allowed him to recover. The final sequence had unfolded with the inevitable precision of a chess match reaching its conclusion. Sarah had recognized Petrov's vulnerability and had pressed her advantage with combinations that showcased every skill she had developed during her amateur and professional careers. Her hand speed had been too much for the champion's compromised defenses, while her power had been accumulating damage that even his granite chin couldn't absorb indefinitely. The knockout punch had been a left hook that Petrov had never seen coming, thrown as part of a three-punch combination that had begun with a jab to create space and continued with a right hand that had drawn his guard up. The hook had landed precisely on the point of his chin with perfect technique and timing, generating force that physics suggested should have been impossible for someone her size. Petrov had dropped immediately, his body going limp before he hit the canvas in a way that left no doubt about the outcome. The referee's count had been academic, but he had completed it anyway while Sarah had stood in the neutral corner, her emotions carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. When the count had reached 10, explosion of sound from 65,000 spectators had been unlike anything heard at a sporting event, a sustained roar of appreciation that had continued for several minutes while medical personnel had attended to the fallen champion. Sarah's celebration had been subdued initially, recognizing the significance of becoming the first woman to win the undisputed heavyweight championship while showing respect for an opponent who had given her the opportunity to make history. Her embrace with Maria Santos in the center of the ring had represented the culmination of a journey that had begun in underground gyms and small-town venues, proving that excellence could emerge from anywhere when supported by proper guidance and unwavering determination. The post-fight interviews had taken place in a ring still buzzing with the energy of what everyone present understood was one of the most significant moments in boxing history. Sarah's comments had been gracious and professional, acknowledging Petrov's courage and skill, while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to compete at the highest level of her sport. Her demeanor had been that of someone who understood she had proven something important while recognizing that much work remained to be done. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's championship victory had created ripple effects that extended far beyond boxing into broader conversations about merit, opportunity, and the artificial barriers that prevented talented individuals from reaching their potential. Sports organizations across multiple disciplines had begun reviewing their own eligibility requirements and competitive structures, recognizing that Sarah's success had established precedents that would be difficult to ignore. The transformation of women's boxing following Sarah's championship victory had been swift and comprehensive, with amateur programs worldwide reporting dramatic increases in female participation and professional opportunities expanding at every level of competition. Her success had proven that women could compete at the highest levels of boxing when given legitimate opportunities, while creating commercial interest that justified increased investment in female fighters' development and promotion. Maria Santos's coaching methods had become subjects of intensive study by trainers seeking to develop fighters who could compete through technical excellence rather than physical advantages alone. The principles she had used to develop Sarah's abilities were being applied to fighters across all weight classes and genders, revolutionizing training approaches throughout professional boxing while proving that intelligence and precision could overcome any physical disadvantage. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's comprehensive documentation of Sarah's career had provided scientific validation for athletic policies that prioritized measurable performance over demographic assumptions, influencing regulatory decisions in sports organizations worldwide. The medical and performance data collected throughout Sarah's professional career had established evidence-based criteria for evaluating competitive capability that would affect future generations of athletes challenging traditional barriers. The Santos Underground Boxing Gym had evolved into an internationally recognized training facility, with fighters traveling from around the world to learn the methods that had produced boxing's most unlikely champion. Maria's philosophy of maximizing individual potential regardless of conventional limitations had attracted athletes from multiple sports who sought to overcome their own barriers to elite competition. Sarah's continued connection to her working-class roots, including her decision to maintain employment at the meatpacking plant despite her championship earnings, had resonated with people who appreciated that success hadn't changed her fundamental character or separated her from the community that had supported her rise to prominence. Her authenticity had distinguished her from other champions who had lost touch with their origins, creating a lasting bond with fans who saw her as representative of their own struggles and aspirations. The heavyweight division's evolution following Sarah's championship victory had been dramatic, with traditional size requirements giving way to merit-based evaluation systems that focused on competitive ability rather than physical dimensions. Her success had attracted a new generation of technically superior fighters to heavyweight boxing, elevating the overall quality of competition while proving that skill and intelligence were more important than raw size. The international impact of Sarah's story had extended to countries where women's sports participation faced cultural and institutional barriers, with her championship victory providing inspiration and evidence that excellence could not be contained by artificial limitations. Boxing federations worldwide had implemented policy changes that reflected lessons learned from her career, while her example had influenced athletic development programs that now prioritized potential over predetermined assumptions about capability. The academic study of Sarah's career had produced research that influenced understanding of athletic performance, gender in sports, and the relationship between physical attributes and competitive success. Universities had developed case studies based on her journey that were being used to train future sports administrators, coaches, and policymakers about the importance of evidence-based decision-making in athletic competition. The commercial success that followed Sarah's championship victory had transformed not only her financial situation, but the entire economic structure of women's boxing, with sponsorship opportunities, television contracts, and purse sizes reaching levels that had previously been unimaginable. Her marketability had proven that female fighters could generate significant revenue when given platforms comparable to their male counterparts, creating sustainable career paths for women in professional boxing. Commissioner Frank Castellanos' successor, Dr. Patricia Williams, had implemented comprehensive reforms to boxing governance that emphasized scientific evaluation of competitive capability over traditional assumptions about physical requirements. The Commission's evolution reflected broader changes in athletic administration that prioritized fairness and evidence over precedent and prejudice, establishing new standards for sports regulation that other organizations had begun adopting. Sarah's championship reign had been marked by continued dominance over challengers who represented the traditional heavyweight prototype, with each successful title defense providing additional evidence that her initial victory had been no accident or anomaly. Her technical skills had continued improving with experience, while her understanding of championship-level competition had allowed her to adapt to the unique pressures and expectations that came with being the face of heavyweight boxing. The Legacy of Sarah Martinez's journey from warehouse worker to heavyweight champion had become a permanent part of boxing history, inspiring countless athletes who faced their own barriers to participation and recognition. Her story had proven that excellence could not be contained by artificial limitations, while demonstrating that institutional change was possible when individuals refused to accept that tradition justified exclusion from opportunities they had earned through merit. The ripple effects of her championship victory continued to influence sports policy and athletic development programs. Years after her historic knockout of Viktor Petrov, with her example serving as evidence that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle when supported by proper guidance and unwavering belief in the possibility of achievement. Sarah Martinez had not just won a championship. She had transformed an entire sport while proving that the only limitations that truly mattered were the ones people imposed on themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.